For this video I want to go over my experiences of breeding cherry shrimp the easy way. By this I mean adding cherry shrimp to a tank that contains various types of fish and leaving them to do their thing. Now this is definitely not the most efficient way to breed cherry shrimp, but it is quick and easy, and I've been able to breed hundreds of cherry shrimp with minimal effort in less than a year. So getting into the breeding strategies for this particular method. The general idea is to set your planted tank up, but also to add as much moss as possible to the aquarium. I've found that the majority of the shrimp in my tanks that use this method tend to stick to the areas of the aquarium that are covered in moss. This makes it very easy for male shrimp to find freshly molted females that are ready to breed regardless of the tank size you use. Not only does the moss provide a large amount of algae and biofilm for the shrimp to eat, but once it's grown in, it also helps to provide plenty of hiding spots from the fish in the tank so the shrimp survive. Due to the cherry shrimp usually being on the moss in the tank, the majority of the baby cherry shrimp will be born directly onto the moss, so they'll have an instant food source, helping to increase the survival rates. Although it's not essential, you can also target feed the shrimp in your tank to increase their calorie and protein intake if you like. One quick point of note is to try and make sure you have both male and female cherry shrimp in your tank, as some people do end up with a bunch of females without males and then end up wondering why they're not breeding. That's pretty much it. This method really is simple and can work in a wide range of different tank setups, but I do want to go over some specifics from my experiences with my own tanks. So getting into tank size, and I've used this exact method to breed cherry shrimp in my 29-gallon tank, my 12-gallon tank and two 8-gallon tanks. I've definitely had the most success in my old 29-gallon tank setup, where I started with 12 cherry shrimp and managed to breed around 350 in 8 months. The larger size of that tank also allowed me to add a lot more moss than my other setups, and moss definitely does seem to be the secret ingredient for this method. The 12-gallon tank still has a decent amount of moss in it, and it definitely comes in second place, as I started with around 5 yellow cherry shrimps and it's been able to produce between 70 and 80 yellow cherry shrimp in around 7 months. My two 8-gallon tanks do have slightly different setups, but they both started with 5 cherry shrimp in each. The first one of them has a small amount of moss in it, but it also does have a betta fish that sometimes eats baby shrimp, but I'd guess that there's around 15 cherry shrimp in here now after around 3 months. My Wallstad betta fish tank doesn't have any moss in it at all, but the shrimp do seem to use the Eliocharis Pasilia in a similar way to how they use moss. Thankfully, the betta fish in my Wallstad setup just likes to watch the cherry shrimp in the tank rather than eat them, so I'd guess that there's around 30 in here now after around 4 months. As you saw, all of my tanks are heavily planted, offering plenty of grazing areas and hiding spots for the shrimp to help increase breeding yields. Moving on to feeding the shrimp, and the best part about this method is that the majority of the food your cherry shrimp will eat will naturally grow in your tank for free. Algae and biofilm will grow on every surface in your aquarium, but moss and Eliocharis do tend to increase the amount of available surface area in a relatively small amount of space, making it the preferred grazing spot for shrimp. It is rare that I intentionally add food specifically for the shrimp in my tanks, as there's usually plenty of leftover food from the fish in here, but I do try and target feed them with an algae wafer at least once per week. Keep in mind, all of my tanks also have Ormano shrimp in them too, and they often bully the cherry shrimp off the food, so the cherries have to go elsewhere and graze on the algae and biofilm. I usually feed my fish with fluval bug bites and various products from the NT Labs range, and my shrimp seem to make do with anything that's left over after the shrimp have eaten. There are a range of specialist shrimp foods on the market, but my cherry shrimp really don't seem too fussed about the ones that I've tried to date. In my experience, my cherry shrimp seem to prefer to just eat the leftover fish food, so try and focus on feeding your fish and let your shrimp eat any leftovers. Sponge filters can be an excellent option for this type of cherry shrimp breeding tank, as there's no filter intake or impeller that can pose a risk to your shrimp, and the shrimp seem to love grazing on the algae, biofilm and leftover food that collects on the sponge. I also try and leave the algae on the back and side panels of my tank, as some of the cherry shrimp do like to graze on it, but this is rare. Moving on to the plants, and I really do think that this is a key part of this method of breeding shrimp in aquariums. Live plants offer a number of different benefits, including hiding spots, grazing areas, while also acting as natural purifiers for your aquarium water. As I mentioned earlier, moss definitely seems to be the most popular plant by far with my cherry shrimp. My old 29-gallon scape had a large amount of Java moss in it, and I know a lot of other shrimp keepers have had a lot of success with this too. Java moss does have a lot of advantages going for it because it's cheap, easy to find, and it can grow quite quite rapidly because it went from this to this in a matter of months. My 12-gallon tank uses Christmas moss, and I personally prefer the look of this over Java moss, but it does seem to grow at a slower pace. In my experiences though, my cherry shrimp just don't seem to care between the two, and to them moss is moss. This clip shows my new dedicated Wallstad cherry shrimp breeding tank that I've recently set up. As you can see, I've tried to add as much moss to the tank as possible. I've added moss to the hardscape of the tank, and I've used small metal grids to make little moss mats while also using some 3D printed shelves to get as much moss into this tank as possible. Floating plants also seem to be a big hit with cherry shrimp too, and I often see my cherry shrimp hanging upside down on the floating plants in their tank, grazing on the algae and biofilm. The only floating plant that I currently use is salvinia, but I have had similar experiences with redroot floaters, Amazon frogbit and duckweed, so there's plenty of options out there. As I mentioned earlier, the shrimp in my 8-gallon Wallstad tank seem to really like the Eliocharis persillea in their tank, and it seems to serve as a less efficient version of moss. The final plant that I've noticed my cherry shrimp congregating on is Bulbitis heduloti, and I often find my cherry shrimp grazing on the algae and biofilm that grow on this plant. I know that Bulbitis is listed as a medium difficulty plant, but I kept mine in a low-tech tank without issue, and it still ended up growing pretty big. Now I do see my shrimp on various stem plants from time to time, but they do seem to get on there, have a little graze, and then move on to other areas pretty quickly, but I do usually only see this in tanks that also have fish on them, so I'm not sure if it's a stress factor that get the shrimp to move on quickly. Now there's plenty of stem plants in the hobby, but I've used things like Rotala, Limnophilia, Hygrophila, Ludwigia and Bacopa, and they can all work well, but personally I would prefer the other plants that I listed previously. So moving on to the water parameters, and in all honesty, outside of ammonia, nitrite and nitrate, I really don't track them as well as people often recommend, and I'll explain why. Ammonia and nitrite are toxic to fish and shrimp, so I usually check these once per week until I'm confident that the tank's established and easily able to deal with any potential spikes. As you've seen, my tanks are heavily planted, so they can usually use up the excess nitrate as a food source before its levels get high enough to become a problem for the shrimp. I set my water temperature to the requirements of the fish that I'll be keeping in the tank rather than the shrimp, as cherry shrimp can thrive in a wide range of water temperatures. Personally, I've kept shrimp in everything from 79 degrees Fahrenheit or 26 degrees Celsius in one of my old scapes, all the way down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 16 degrees Celsius in an unheated shrimp jar. The shrimp really didn't seem to mind in all of these different tank setups, but one thing I would say is that they didn't breed in the unheated shrimp jar, but they've bred in all of my other tanks that go as low as 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius. I know that people often recommend that you track your total dissolved solids or TDS, but personally I really don't bother anymore when breeding cherry shrimp. The issue with TDS is that it doesn't track exactly what solids are actually being tracked by the test equipment, so I don't think it's worth putting the time and effort into tracking it, as there's too many variables that can be incorrect. GH is in a similar boat to this, and I have a KH and GH test kit, but it is rare that I use them these days. I've been having problems with my orange cherry shrimp in my newer 40-gallon scape, and all of the water parameters checked out countless times, and I just couldn't find the issue that kept causing problems with the shrimp. When doing some research, I found an article on shrimplyexplained.com that points out that GH test kits have a similar issue to TDS test kits. They don't actually tell you the actual mineral breakdown that they are registering or the ratio of the minerals that they're picking up. This means that your GH test kit can suggest that you are within your recommended ranges, like in my 40-gallon tank, but the actual ratio of calcium and magnesium can be way off what's actually required for your cherry shrimp. Now, to be clear, I'm not telling you not to track your TDS or GH in your tank. It's your setup and you do what you want, but personally I really don't plan to do this anymore with Neocaridina shrimp. Now, I have seen several different points raised when it comes to the pH of tanks that contain cherry shrimp, but personally I try and maintain the pH in mine between 7.0 and 8.0. Technically, cherry shrimp can live in a pH that's below this, and I've personally done it myself, but the mineral content of the water can become an issue. So moving on to tank mates that I've personally used with my cherry shrimp when breeding them in this type of tank setup. Starting out with my old 29-gallon tank setup, as this is the one that I had the most success with due due to its larger size, and this tank contained neon tetras, corydoras, chili rasboras and honey gourami. Now in all honesty, I really didn't see any interaction between the neon tetras and the chili rasboras with my cherry shrimp. They just tended to do their own thing and stay away from everything in the tank. My corydoras did sometimes accidentally bump into my cherry shrimp when they were looking for food, but this really wasn't intentional. I'm pretty sure it was just the cory knew there was food near it and it got excited and stopped paying attention to its surroundings. I was a little worried about keeping honey gourami, as I've seen people say that they've had issues with keeping them with cherry shrimp, but personally I didn't. I do have a dedicated video going over keeping honey gourami with shrimp that I link in the card and description, but I saw them swim past tiny little baby cherry shrimp countless times and I never once saw them try to eat them. My 12-gallon tank originally only contained male guppies, but I have recently added my chili rasboras and my honey gourami to it because I'm currently rescaping my 29-gallon tank. Now keep in mind I did only keep male guppies, and female guppies can be larger, so your experiences may differ, but I never really seen any interaction between my male guppies and my shrimp, but I do have a dedicated video going over it that I link in the card and description. Next up we have betta fish, and again I have a dedicated video sharing my experiences of keeping betta fish with cherry shrimp that's linked in the card and description. But the key thing here is that the personality of your betta fish will be the deciding factor. For example, I had Skittles who would try and eat any of the cherry shrimp that she could see in her tank, and then I have Stitch who sometimes eats the baby cherry shrimp if they get too close to him, but he really doesn't intentionally hunt them down. And then finally I have Cooley who seems to see the cherry shrimp in his tank as his babies, and he likes to watch them and look after them rather than eat them. The point is that there's a wide range of common freshwater fish in the hobby that can work well in this type of cherry shrimp breeding tank setup. So moving on to culling, and I really don't like this term as most shrimp keepers don't actually cull their reject shrimp, they just put them into a different tank to live out the rest of their lives outside of their breeding line. Anyway, one of the main downsides of breeding cherry shrimp using this method is the lack of culling can lead to the line becoming weaker and weaker and the colour gradually deteriorating in your shrimp. These have been kept in my aquariums for around 9 months now without any culling at all, which allowed the low grade shrimp to breed with the higher grade shrimp and gradually bring the colour of their shrimp down. Personally, I'm actually quite happy that this has happened, as it gives me a nice little side project to try and gradually bring the quality of these cherry shrimp back up in this dedicated breeding tank. You can try and implement culling and selective breeding in larger tanks that use this method, but the plants, hardscape and fish in the tank can make it more difficult to get the rejected shrimp out of the aquarium. Now I know that I went on a bit there and this may sound difficult, but it really isn't. Essentially you're going to set your tank up as normal, add plenty of plants and moss, put a mix of male and female cherry shrimp into the tank once it's completed its cycle, and wait a couple of months for babies to show up. Some of the baby shrimp may end up being eaten by the other fish in your tank, but the cherry shrimp population in all of my tanks, bar the one where the betta fish would eat anything she saw, has constantly increased. Anyway guys, that brings the video to an end. I hope you found it helpful. Thanks for watching and have a good day.